Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Joyce from ThoughtWorks in Australia, so thanks very much for coming for the talk today. Today I'm going to be talking about the need for a different method for portfolio management. And in order to do so, I'm going to contrast the differences between the old and the new. The differences between what I would term traditional portfolio management and 21st century portfolio management. And I'll explain how we can evolve from the traditional to the new and what's required today in the 21st century. So let's start off with what we call a PMO. Has anyone heard that term before? PMO, yeah. Anyone got any PMO in their organisation? A few hands. So if you Google around or spend time in organisations, it usually stands for one of these kind of things: project management office, a program management office, a portfolio management office. I need a deep breath for this one. A strategic program management office, or some kind of derivative of those kind of things. It might be an enterprise PMO, a separate line of business PMO, or it might be an IT PMO. And it may not even be called PMO in your organisation, but the underlying traditional thinking that's prevalent in most of today's organisations you'll most likely recognise as I go through the talk today. So traditionally, portfolio management is concerned with two things: governance, including monitoring and reporting, and also compliance, which is known as execution management. Now, when I talk to people in organisations, particularly agile people, about PMOs, it kind of conjures up these images in their heads. So let's explore what they focus on and how they're all based around traditional conventional thinking. So traditionally, to kick off any piece of work, it starts with an idea, a high-level set of requirements, or just a vision of what we want to produce. And usually there's some kind of benefits that we attach to that. And based on this information, a budget is set, resources are allocated, and either a project or a program is started. Do you recognise that in your organisations? So we allocate some resources and off the project goes. And thereafter, the governance process is largely making sure that we do things in terms of ensuring monitoring and reporting, that things happen within a required time frame and that a required budget is met. When you actually investigate that in more detail, very little effort is expended on have we actually realised any value. And next we have compliance, which is also known as execution management, as I mentioned a minute ago. And what we're handling here under the traditional mindset is we're confusing process compliance with performance improvement. So traditionally we're focused almost entirely on defining and enforcing a process. So the underlying thinking there is, did we follow a process? And rather than did we actually deliver any value to our customers? And this often results in a series of tick boxes to be checked, or a process that we need to follow and make sure it's being followed. So it's really almost an auditing and a compliance function. But where does this traditional thinking come from? Well, there's very few writers on this subject, but there's one writer called Dean Leffingwell, who's one of the few agile writers on this subject, and he calls them legacy waterfall mindsets. And it's these mindsets that really limit our ability to have true business agility. So let's read a quote here from Leffingwell. He says, "Many impediments rise to a ceiling that's beyond the control of teams. Sometimes this ceiling is represented by the PMO, a place many agilists perceive to be the mothership of all impediments. It should come as no surprise to agile teams and programs are being held accountable to legacy waterfall practices for governance and traditional methods of project management, as they're all based around legacy mindsets. But that's all that there was." So if you look back 10 or 11 years ago when the Agile Manifesto came out, it was really around software delivery, around teams. Nothing was really said at the portfolio level. And even if you look around in terms of books and on the web today, there's not a lot of people talking about what happens beyond the team and at the portfolio level. So Leffingwell goes on to describe these legacy waterfall mindsets in more detail. So let's look at each one. So first one, we've got what we call widget engineering. And this mindset is based around the belief that knowledge work is almost like a manufacturing-like process. And you saw that with the Toyota Cutter talk earlier today. So it's almost a readily controlled, repeatable process. And if you examine the underlying thinking there, it's draw it up and then build it like we drew it. The next one is an order-taking mentality, where IT are there to see, it's almost like McDonald's. They take orders, they build software. And it's the underlying thinking there is you build what we tell you to build. And you can see this reinforced in the Scrum product owner model. We will build what the product owner asks us to build. They're the proxy customer. And next we have maximized utilization. And the belief here is that if resources aren't fully utilized on paper, they won't be fully utilized in practice. And to summarize that thinking is the more we start, the more we finish. The next one is control through milestones. And this belief here is we can tell wherever we are on any type of project by just asking for the right kind of data at project milestones. And if we still can't tell where we are, we just ask for more and more detailed data. The next one is a big one, so we can plan a year's worth of projects in advance. And this conveniently disregards our last 20 years or so of experience of failing to be able to do that. But when I speak to execs about this, they say, well, it's the failure of our planning paradigm, not the failure of our basic paradigm. And the response to me is, well, David, if only we planned in more detail, I really think we can get it right this year. And the last one is the just get it done mentality. And this belief is that our best case plans can become a reality as long as people tried hard enough. So this is known as, this is the plan that we agreed to, now go ahead and execute it. And it leads to reliance on heroes. So you hear people say, well, we know it's impossible, well, that's why I wanted you, David, on this project. Now, do you recognize these in your organization? Now, some of you might have got into your happy place. Oh, no. Okay, but this is most Western organizations. Now, although Leffingwell calls these legacy waterfall mindsets, these mindsets actually came to be from way before the 1970s when waterfall was invented. So I want to show you a quick video, okay? And this video was taken in 1890. And here on this video, you can see some of the world's first consultants up there with their clipboards, and you can see a clock spinning around. And what they're doing is they're timing worker activities. This is Frederick Taylor's scientific management in action. And what they're doing is they're timing how much work can be done in a day and how long tasks should take. And this then formed best practices that were then placed in Henry Gantt's charts, also invented in the 1890s. He worked closely with Taylor. And it enabled management to know if you're ahead, behind, or on schedule. And if you're ahead of schedule, you were offered a bonus. The bonus system invented by Henry Gantt in 1890. Seem familiar? Still using that today. Now, this is the early 1900s. Again, this is a chart from 1919, and it's what Gantt called his man record chart. Okay? And it's taken from his book, Organizing the Work. And Gantt said that this chart should be used to record what a worker should do in a day against what they did do, and if they failed to meet what they should have done, you make that a note on the chart. And this is still what's used in use today, albeit a computerized version of Microsoft Project. In addition, many consultants are timing workers today, and also project managers ask developers, for example, to estimate on tasks which they place in charts that were invented in 1890, and then apply pressure if you're not meeting those estimates. And then finally, we've got Gantt's idle chart from 1916, and this shows Gantt's determination that no one should be idle. And you heard David Anderson talk about that this morning. You shouldn't have them on Facebook. Okay, so no one should be idle. But this is classic cost-based accounting and fixation on utilization that's still so pervasive today. So Taylor was the world's first management consultant, and there's a management guru called Drucker, and he says there's three makers of the modern world. There's Freud, Darwin, and Taylor. Yet most people have never heard of Taylor, but how you're working today is based on his management science. And Taylor sought to drive out craft production. He hated craft production, and you can see that re-emerging today in the way that we think about knowledge work such as software, where people are almost becoming commoditized assets. And a good signal for that is I often work with people who call other people resources, or I've got to have 0.25 of a resource on that project, so they become a commoditized asset. Now, what's interesting is that seeing this video, looking at those charts, your brain tells you this is old, okay? Yet it's still exactly how we design and manage work. Today it's still based around the same kind of thinking. So I believe it's time for some different thinking, some 21st century thinking. But the question has to be asked, though, why do we need to change? So although what I've said might seem true to you, it just does work, doesn't it? It's just how we do software projects. But it's certainly what most of the big consultancies advise and what you would learn if you did an MBA or went through management school. But the thing is, one of our most commonly held beliefs is change can be manageable, and therefore it's small, and it can be limited, and that conformance to the plan is key. This may have once been true, but there's a guy called Rob Tomset who's been doing project management for about 30 years, agile project management, one of the first, and he spends a lot of time with companies, and he's noted through his studies that what he calls the window of change today is less than 3 months, when it used to be a period of 2 years. So now we all know this is a rapidly changing environment, so if we have a plan that's longer than 3 months, you can almost guarantee that you're out of date. But we kind of know this in Agile, don't we? We think Agile fixes this. Well, in my experiences, this is what most organizations have when they do Agile or they use Kanban. They have a waterfall front end up here, and how they define projects and they select projects and how they select releases. They modify that middle bit to do Agile and Kanban and things like this. And then they retain a waterfall tail end for release scheduling and integration testing. And this has been termed to me recently as the waterfall sandwich, which I thought was quite nice. So you've got Agile in between the two ends of waterfall. And what happens when you visit these teams is they say, well, things are great because we're getting things out faster. But actually, from a customer or end user point of view, they think from that point there to that point there, and that's what I define as lead time, that time hasn't actually reduced. So therefore, maybe it isn't as successful as we want. We want to look at from concept through to cash, from idea to when we actually realize the value. And what's even more disturbing is I spend a lot of time in companies and they've got no idea how long that takes. They can tell me how long this bit takes, but they've got no idea how long it takes from end to end, from idea to value realization. So what's the alternative to all this is what I would call the 21st century lean and agile portfolio. And it's a combination of building the thing right, which is effectiveness, and building the right thing, which is effectiveness, and building things right, which is efficiency. And it's a move away from Taylorism and a pure focus on efficiency and utilization, and evolving into what's required today for the 21st century. So now let's look at how we can evolve from the traditional to 21st century, and I'm going to go through a series of steps in the rest of the talk. So the first thing I believe we need to look at is evolving from detailed business cases and detailed plans based upon really educated best guesses to making portfolio decisions based on experimentation and knowledge and learning. And it's really important that we get this one right because it's right at the start of the chain. Okay? So if we get what we call a clean front end, everything else that flows from it is going to improve. So it was Deming who famously said, knowledge is not the same as intelligence. And he often said that knowledge is often, or experience is often mistaken to be knowledge. So if we're really experienced at something, that's the same as knowledge. But when I speak to people, I say, what type of problem are you trying to solve? Or what's the value this is going to bring? And often I get a series of vague answers or educated best guesses. So to truly understand if we're building the right thing, we need to go and study, we need to go and deliver, we need to go and measure, and then we need to go and learn as fast as possible. And I spent many years now in the Agile community, and my view is that thus far we've been predominantly focused on fast delivery. In other words, building the thing right. So fast delivery with high quality. Now, if you read Taylor's book from 1911, that's exactly what he was trying to do, okay? But what if it's the wrong solution, or if we're trying to solve the wrong problem, or we're building products that customers won't buy? So if you think about it, we need to bring considerably more to the table than just our technical ability to transform user stories into product in a more efficient way. So traditionally, business cases take months to define and they become overly detailed. And even agile teams who try to reduce this by holding workshops still fall foul of the same underlying problem, which is the people in the workshops are basing their workshops on experience and opinion as opposed to knowledge through study. So Rob Tomset says that business cases should be filed in the science fiction section, and I'm with him on that one. So these business cases then turn into equally detailed portfolio plans and project plans, and it all gives us this false impression of precision in which we make millions of dollars of funding decisions on. And these plans quickly become out of date despite armies of people trying to keep them up to date. Now, we're aware of this in Agile, but there's another problem with plans, as Eric Ries from the Lean Startup Movement says. He says we spend a lot of time planning. We even make contingency plans for what to do if the main plan goes wrong. But what if the main plan goes right and we still fail? This is one of the most dreaded kinds of failure because it tricks you into thinking you're in control and that you're succeeding. In other words, it inhibits your learning. We're following the plan. We must be okay. So the question we should be asking, it's not can it be done, it's should it be done. So a better method to go and answer this question is to go and study. Now, I'm not suggesting we return back to overly long analysis phases or analysis paralysis, as some people talk about it. I'm talking about short learning loops, in other words, experimentation that helps us to understand the problem and get knowledge, and we then base our initiatives based upon that knowledge through learning. So I believe that most of what we do in the software world is complex in its nature. It's, in terms of Cynefin, its outcome is unknowable. In other words, it's unpredictable. So most of it lives in this kind of domain up here, in the complex domain. So in the complex domain, what we need to do is create experiments that help us learn, so then we can then get knowledge. But if you really feel that you have got something that's in the complicated or simple domain, in other words, you can predict that when we build this thing, we can predict the value it's going to give us, then it lives over here. But certainly in my career, most of the software that I've built, I've worked with teams that are building, we really can't predict the value. In other words, it's in the complex domain, it's unknowable. So with any kind of complex issue, we need to create what we call safe-to-fail experiments rather than full-scale, fail-safe project designs. And these experiments, they need to be simple, short-term, coherent, and low cost. So at any given time, many can be in train. And in every instance, whether an experiment succeeds or fails, it helps us add to our learning. And you can see an example up here from Cognitive Edge of an experiment template. Now, some of the teams that I'm working with are no longer using stories, they're using this instead. So making changes based on inadequate knowledge can lead to costly mistakes. Change must be based upon knowledge. And getting knowledge through experimentation and learning should replace the whole business case methodology that's so ubiquitous in our organizations today. So to be more effective, decisions should be made on knowledge and understanding, and that then leads to informed choice on everyone on how best to proceed. So 21st century portfolio management will base decisions on learned knowledge through study, hypothesis, and experiments that they can then base their plans upon. So in software, what's the biggest way to reduce waste and increase productivity is to write less code. In other words, build less unused features. So the lean and agile governance switches from promise and delivery to that promise. In other words, we'll do this in 6 months. We did it in 6 months, tick. To did we solve the problem or did we realize the opportunity? And really importantly, what did we learn? Now, some organizations have already moved to this, and there's a really large organization in the UK, and their IT portfolio group have one gate. It's not have you got funding, which is most of the organizations. They say, is this initiative based on empirical data of what matters to customers? In other words, can you empirically show that when we do this, it's going to make lives better for customers? If they can't show that, then it's not started. Okay, so we'll shift away from detailed business cases and detailed plans. The next step in our evolution is to move from annual to incremental funding. Now, we all see it ludicrous. If I opened a new bank and I said, the only problem with this bank is that I can only make loans once a year, just for 1 month, okay? You would never use that bank. Yet that's exactly the model we have in most of our organizations. And the annual budgeting process is a painful and a lengthy process. It consumes teams for weeks, and when I speak to execs, it often consumes people for months. And it results in a marginally useful plan that isn't really revisited until the cycle begins the following year. So let's hear what Leffingwell says. He says another pernicious aspect of the legacy model is the tendency for all or none funding. This means that once funds are committed, they become virtually impossible to deallocate. Further, the commitments are included in the annual budgeting planning process, whereby every department needs to justify the continual use of resources, people, throughout a fiscal year. And to do that, managers often need to show how the individuals are dedicated into tasks well into the future. And to do that, they need to create even more detailed plans that justify the annual budget. Now, this is a vicious cycle, and this results in exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, which is true business agility. But where does it come from? Well, it comes from the early 1920s. A guy called Alfred Sloan of GM and his CFO, Donaldson Brown, they invented budgeting. But the first ever book, written in 1923, was by a guy called James McKinsey. He was a professor at the time, and it became very successful, so he gave up his role as a professor and formed the McKinsey Consulting Services. You may have heard of them, one of the big four. And they provided financial and budgeting services. And if you read the book, someone like me in Anorak has, it's almost identical to the budgeting process that we use in organizations today. But the problem is it has a number of unwanted side effects that limit our true ability to have business agility. And we fall into a trap of what I call budgeteering, where often they'll have an organization, so here's an organization, these guys have budget, and we say, yeah, but if we spend a bit more money, it makes the whole organization better. And they say, no, you're not listening. We're the ones with budget. You've got to build what we build. So you do sub-optimized change. Another one is that divisions keep a bit of money back. It's called a safety margin. But they do that in case headquarters squeeze them on budget. It's okay, we've got a safety margin. But the thing is, headquarters know they're doing it anyway, so they squeeze them anyway. But that's okay, because I've got another safety margin here, but they know that too, and it goes on and on and on. Another is that we've got to spend our budget or we'll lose it next year. So often I work with leaders and they say, I've just got to spend this money because I'll lose it next year, or I'll be penalized for poor forecasting. Or we just focus on CapEx and OpEx, which is what I call BDD, budget-driven development. And I remember one of the first leaders I worked with about Agile, I said, why are you doing Agile? And they said, because it gets me to CapEx faster. So most organizations I work with focus on cost, and they report if projects are on time or on budget, and that's their measure of success. But to understand cost without understanding value is really to understand nothing at all. So 21st century portfolio management doesn't think about the individual bits. They think end-to-end from a customer's point of view. And if you think about it, budgeting is irrelevant to performance improvement. And also what we'll find is organizations that study, they actually spend less time budgeting because they have knowledge-based budgeting, so it makes the whole process shorter. Now, there is a bit of a problem with this, and that is that budgets really are sacrosanct in many organizations. There is the beyond budgeting movement, which is slowly getting traction. So I want to tell you something that you can do even with an existing budget construct in your organizations. So rather than an all-or-nothing approach, here's X number of $1 million for the next 2 years, we can use a new model that's akin to venture capitalist funding. And the whole process starts off with a potential opportunity, and it could be an opportunity to save money through IT or improve process or something like this. And through study, we've got some idea of a potential return. And then what happens is the Lean and Agile Governance Committee give out a small portion of money, so not millions of dollars, but a small portion of money. And that enables a team to have initial investigation of the business opportunity and the initial development. And those activities happen in parallel with each other. And this accelerates the work, it increases flexibility, and also it gives us the best opportunity to go and learn. And when the money runs out, you then return back to the Lean and Agile Governance Committee and say, this is what we've learned. And if you can demonstrate progress in technology and progress in business opportunity, then you're awarded more money. And then that cycle then repeats iteratively, and possibly the team can then grow. So the next step really is evolving from managing way too many projects at once, what I call managing congestion, to managing flow, where we start limiting the number of projects in progress. So David Anderson talks a lot about limiting the number of tasks in progress for the team. Here we're talking projects at the portfolio level. Now the fact is, and you've probably heard this through various talks today, that we as human beings are very poor at multitasking and context switching. Now some people tell me that's just religious nonsense, but there's real science that shows this. And things become even worse when you've got groups of human beings that are context switching. But in many organizations I visit, they have this, where nearly every project is started. You might kind of recognize that. And as I said before, the only question that we ask here is, have you got money? And if they say, yes, we've got budget, then in it goes. We allocate resources and the project is started. So these sort of organizations have sophisticated processes for managing congestion, not for managing flow. And the whole system comes completely flooded with work. And as a result, time to innovate goes down. You've just got to keep churning through the work, as does quality. And ultimately, morale goes down, one of the basic human needs of pride in our work. And as a result of this, the time to deliver goes longer. If you imagine there's more things to do, so end to end, it takes longer to do, and therefore less value gets realized. So traditional thinking managers are really focused on the more we start, the more we finish, where in truth, the more we finish, the more we finish. So to be more effective, we need to remove the causes of poor flow. So things like multitasking, managing by arbitrary completion dates, and constantly shifting priorities. And once you start doing that counterintuitively, your throughput goes up. So we want to create steady, even a flow of items that flow through our system. And we want people to stop starting working on bits, instead to start finishing. Now, this has been well known in the Kanban community, both at the personal Kanban world, when you're doing this as an individual, and also at the team level with David Anderson's Kanban. But where it gets a lot more difficult is at the portfolio level, because you're working beyond the team and you're working in the realms of conventional management thinking. So what's needed at the portfolio level is a list of work that's clearly ordered by value. And we want clear policies to determine how best to start work. And we need to ask, first of all, what's the purpose of all the work in our portfolio from our customer's point of view? And what we can use is something like this from Stephen Parry. So you've got the classic 4-box grid here, but you say, does the work matter to customers, yes or no? You'd know that through study. If it's yes, it goes over here. Is the work functional, in other words, just for one particular department, or is it end-to-end? Does it improve the whole organization, in which case it will be there? So these are your gold projects. These are the vital few, as Duran called it. These are the ones that we should really be focusing on. Now, many organizations I work in, they say we place the customer at the center of all we do. We love the customer. We should always be thinking about the customer, yet most of the work is down there. And when I ask them, what kind of problems are you currently working on? Most of the problems they're trying to solve are down there. So we can use this kind of method to go and cast over our portfolio. But this leads to a bit of a question, doesn't it? What do we do with this stuff? Okay? Well, we need to stop those projects. And if we stop the projects, we can then end up with something like this. Now, stopping or freezing projects is a really difficult conversation to have. There's two main reasons for this. First is sunk cost syndrome. I've spent $2 million. If I stop the project, I know I've got another 8 to spend, but if I stop it, I've lost $2 million. Or another is CapEx and OpEx. If I stop the project, that $2 million goes into my OpEx budget, and that's no good. But we need a method to stop those projects, because if we don't, you're always going to be managing congestion. So for organizations that do this, and I'm working with an organization that does this at the moment, we have a one-out, one-in system. So when we finish one project, we take another project in. And counterintuitively, this increases throughput as context switching is reduced. So to be effective, we need to focus on, stop the focus on everyone must be busy, no one must be idle. Remember, this is born out of the focus from Taylor and Gant, to what's the most effective use of our resources. But this is new territory for most organizations. So the 21st century portfolio management identifies that vital few projects. They have a clear prioritization policy, everyone understands it, and they facilitate the stopping process and become the guardians of single piece flow. So evolving to managing flow of projects is a massive step into the 21st century. However, if you think about it, having a one-out, one-in system of 2-year-long projects isn't really that great. So the next thing we want to do is remove projects and go to small independent units of value. But what's wrong with projects? Okay, well, it's another one of these things that we regard as sacrosanct, and people quite regularly tell me, well, surely you have to have projects in software. How could you possibly not have projects? Well, let's hear what Leffingwell says on that. He says, traditionally based on a construction-like metaphor, a project gathers some people together, a set of requirements, a mission, start and end date, and a project manager. And the project then brings these things together in a package that's fixed and immutable. And once started, every project develops its own antibodies to change. No one wants to be part of a cancelled project. But how do you innovate in that environment? Innovation is about failing and learning, but you don't want to fail if you're in that environment. The other oddity that I see a lot in organizations is we spin a project team up, and then they've gone through storming, norming, and performing, and just at the point they're most productive, we disband them, and then we start them all over again. Now, when I speak to people about this, they said, yeah, but that's just how you do software projects. We spin a team up, they do the project, and then we disband them again. So what's the alternative to all that? Well, the alternative really is we don't start projects off each time we get a request. It's inefficient and it's ineffective. And if we can accept that work can be broken down into independent units of value, which we do in the Agile and Kanban's community, then instead of having teams spun up into projects, we have long-lived teams where work is pulled into those teams by the teams themselves. And they're called work cells, they're long-lived work teams. And they have end-to-end accountability and end-to-end capability. And these work cells have really good internal metrics. So when we took a piece of work, how long does it take? They keep those kind of metrics. And there's two reasons they're internal. One is if they're internal, you're more likely to keep them. The second is when they are no longer internal, they usually end up as targets or SLAs, and then usual gaming then ensues. And these work cells, if you think about it, let's say we're a work cell, we might get a piece of work which we can't do because we haven't got the expertise, but we don't hand that work off to someone because we're losing the tacit knowledge. What we do is we pull in a specialist from a pool of specialists, and we do that work together, and that means I then learn how to do that in future. So we put learning and development into the work design. So we move away from separate functions such as design and architecture and operations and lowest placed vendors, etc. Instead, we have cross-functional groups that can take in a piece of work, and there's people in there with enough skills to do that work all the way through. So I mentioned legacy order taking. That's not really the right model. Instead, we need to have problem-solving teams. So we get people that frame the problem and people that fix the problem. Now, certainly in my career in IT, some of the most well-read and intelligent people in organizations work in IT, and yet we treat them as just build stuff. It'd be good if we actually use some of those brain power to work together and to frame problems and solve problems. So what we're doing there is we're moving away from handoffs, which was waterfall, and we're moving, then a lot of organizations have moved to agile, which is collaboration. Now I'm advocating we move to integration. So from handoffs to collaboration, and in the 21st century we move to integration, where people that are technologists are working alongside with people who have the problem. So the role of 21st century portfolio management is to facilitate the creation of these delivery work cells, and they provide transparency to portfolio level policies governing delivery. They ensure that each piece of work item is clear on the value we expect, and that the most applicable work cell, they pull that work, and they facilitate the pull of specialists from this specialist work pool. Now, with smaller discrete pieces of work, we're able to deliver more often, and we've got more maneuverability. But what are these small discrete pieces of work, and how do they tie in with the experiments that I mentioned earlier? Well, in the Lean and Agile community, there's all sorts of names. There's things like MMFs, PSIs, epics, features, all sorts of different names. But I like the term minimal viable product. And that's not because it's fashionable, but I like the word viable. Because if you think about it, that until they have contact with a customer or end user, it's just a hypothesis. We don't really know if they're of value or not. It's potentially viable. So you can almost think of them as minimal viable experiments, as Eric Ries is now calling them. So let's look at our journey of Agile. We started off by having done, which means it works beyond my machine. Okay, do you remember people used to say that, well, it worked on my machine, so we moved to that. And then we went to done. In other words, it's product ready. And then more recently, we've gone to continuous deployment, where we're continuously deploying software. And then even more recently, continuous delivery, where we switch features on, so our business colleagues can decide when we switch the features on. And that's good. But if you think about it, there's little value in continuously delivering the wrong thing. So I believe the next stage is continuous validated learning. And it's remarkable the number of organizations that I work with who have no idea, did the software we released actually have any value? Because the value part was the business case just to get the funding. So has anyone seen this before? It's the build, measure, learn loop from Eric Ries. He says that what we should do is we go and build, we measure, and we learn as fast as possible. So I say that I overlaid this, we should go and study. That's the first point, to generate our ideas. And then what we do is we then go and build experiments to go and test those ideas, test those assumptions. And then these two areas are predominantly where Agile lives, where we're doing continuous design and continuous delivery. And then we get data, and then we're into the realms of continuous validated learning. So I believe unless we overlay that on top of that model, we're still going to be going into workshops, having things, generating ideas without a position of knowledge. So if you think about it, as battle plans, very few battle plans survive after first contact because there's too many unknown unknowns. So if you think about it, nearly every item on your board really is an experiment. You don't really know the value of that item until it's actually in the hands of the people that are going to use it. So the 21st century portfolio management, their unit of measure is validated learning, not on time and on budget. So based upon our learning and using this newfound knowledge, we can decide whether we want to persevere, pivot, or stop. So the final step in this evolution is to have what I call radical visibility. And we want visibility over the entire end-to-end flow, not just a Kanban board that sits in there. And the best way to manage risk really is visibility, because if you think about it, risk is where knowledge ends. So we don't want complete standardization, and we don't want to hide progress in Gantt charts or spreadsheets or PowerPoint packs. So let me just speak over that. So most Kanban boards that I visit, they have nothing that looks left of the board and nothing that looks right. In other words, nothing that says what problem were we trying to solve, and nothing that looks right that says did we actually solve that problem. It's usually a team trying to make themselves more efficient. So here you can see an example of a portfolio Kanban board, and this is looking now end to end. It's looking both left and right. So let's look at that board in a bit more detail. So first off, we have a study column up here. And these are just ideas that we're going to go and test hypotheses of and go and study. And next we have these minimal viable products, where we've chosen the next most important idea, which was at the top. And we've got some policy there that says, how are we going to go and build this? How are we going to validate it? And how are we going to measure it? So if you turn that card over, it just hasn't got acceptance criteria. It also has validation and measurement criteria. And then we can limit those number of MVPs as well, because we don't want to flood downstream with work. And the next few columns are your standard building stuff, so what I call experiment building. And this is where work is broken down into epics, and they're pulled by the team. So each one of these epics would go into a team-level Kanban board. But on this board, we're not limited about that level of detail. We're extrapolated up. And we can limit the number of MVPs that are in progress, again, to stop that task switching. And we know these three are the three most important MVPs that we're currently working on. And here you can see epics are blocked. If they're blocked, it gives us a clear indication. You can also clearly see dependencies between work cells. And with blockers, again, we can use the Cynefin framework. If we had a blocker at the portfolio level, can we just make a simple change to change that so it doesn't happen again? Do we need to create some kind of project with experts, or is there some experiments we need to try to stop that from happening again? And once these experiments are built, then these pass into the learning columns. So those that are deployed are in our continuous deployment. Those that are released are in continuous delivery. So I can easily see these things we've deployed but not yet switched on. These things we have actually switched on. And here I can see we've got a bit of a problem because we're not getting any telemetry back. So is there some remedial work that we need to do? Now, for most agile teams and Kanban teams, this is where the story stops. But as previously discussed, beyond continuous delivery, we want continuous validated learning. So these are our new columns. So the new one is validated. Did we validate that assumption? Yes, we did. So we put them in there. Or it could be that we pivot. It was close, but there seems that we need to do something else, so we put them in there. Or we failed completely, which is okay, we've learned. And organizations that do this, it makes failure not something we want to hide under the carpet. We can see that now on the board, and it promotes learning. And this board is cyclical, so if we're going to pivot, it will now generate a new idea. So we start the idea and we start the whole process up again. And team members comprising of each work cell will regularly meet around that kind of board, and they'll talk about progress, they'll talk about dependencies, blockers, overload, underload, those kind of things. And the really important thing they talk about is what have we learned across the portfolio. And we can also do things like tracking the number of items of the portfolio. So here we can see number of items. Or what we're starting to do now with organizations is how many millions of dollars are stuck. So how many millions of dollars are stuck in development? How many millions of dollars are stuck in integration testing? How many millions of dollars have we actually realized with validated learning that is actually of value? We can also visualize the age of our portfolio. So here we can see we've got loads of things that are around 9 or 10 months old. So as we break that work down and have less and less projects, you expect that to reduce. We also shouldn't limit our reflection processes to PIRs, end of project reviews. Instead, we should constantly learn and have these sessions, if not on a weekly basis, if not more often, where the whole team is learning and reviewing. And what happens here is, because this is an end-to-end board, we get our value chain partners working together on that board, and it removes this blame culture to an end-to-end culture of continuous improvement. And it makes tracking and progress far more visible to everybody. So the board that I've just shown you is just an example. What columns you'd have would be entirely up to you, but we're working with organizations that use this for non-software type work, so process change work or strategy work. But basically it enables you to visualize the work across a portfolio and enables you to test hypotheses rather than basing millions of dollars on untested assumptions. So just want to finish off, why is Kanban such a critical element to this? Well, there's a great book that I recommend you read called The Birth of Lean. And the reason why it's so great, it was written by people who were there, the Japanese, not by Americans who studied them 30, 40 years later. Okay? And there's a guy called Tanaka who was a Daihatsu executive, and he spent a long time working under Ono, who was one of the architects of the Toyota production system. And he says, Ono-san, I want you to know I was completely wrong about the Kanban. I thought of it entirely in terms of reducing work in process, raising productivity, and illuminating problems. Of course, it's good for all those things, but your basic aim was something else, wasn't it? You used the Kanban to create a positive tension in the workplace by reducing work in process, and that motivates people to do better than they ever thought that they can do. And yet most talks that I go to, they're talking at the top level there about efficiency, where really the tool of Kanban is to drive innovation and drive a method for continual improvement, which is why it's so important as a 21st century portfolio management tool. So to summarize then really, even though traditional models and assumptions represent thinking that originated in the 1890s with Frederick Taylor's focus on efficiency and utilization, and Gantt, inventing the Gantt chart and the bonus system, they seem remarkably impervious to change. And if you think about it, since that time, we've got manned flight, we've got people on the moon, we've got mobile phones, we've got computers, yet everything else we've innovated apart from how we design and manage work. And when organizations go agile or do Kanban, and they do that using traditional perspectives of productivity and efficiency, it's all based on industrial thinking. They can't realize true business agility, which is what we're trying to do. So companies that are able to break free of what we call their entrained thinking can focus on building the right thing as well as building things right. So I think they've got a better chance of thriving and surviving. So to finish then, I just want to summarize why this is so difficult to do, because it's not sort of something you can just go ahead and do straight away. And I think this provides some insight into why things haven't changed since the 1890s. So Toffler says, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. But in most organizations, it's all about learn more, learn more, learn more. We never question our underlying beliefs. But as John Galbraith says, faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no need to do so, almost everybody gets involved on the proof. It's just easier, isn't it? So you might have thinking you didn't believe a word I said, or you might be thinking, well, if it's not broke, why should I fix it? Or you might be thinking, well, this is just theory, can you actually do it? Well, I'm actually working in a really large Australian telco at the moment, and they've got tens of thousands of staff, and we're implementing all of these things that you're seeing here. So in the finance department, the contracts department, as well as in IT as well. So it is perfectly possible, but what you need to find is a leader that's willing to go and try some experiments and then test this out for yourself. So thanks very much for your attention. Have we got time for questions? Yes. Oh, they're going to run for a microphone.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is, how do you show dependencies on your board? You mentioned that you can see dependencies between the MVPs.
So that's on that particular board, that's a simplified version, but you could say that this is dependent on that. So some organizations, they've got bits of string, or you can draw something.
Also just having some tags.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's just so it's visible for everyone. So when you're at a portfolio level, if this is blocked, you know this, this, and this are all waiting on that.
So some visualization of that.
That's right, yeah.
And then my second question was on, you brought up Stephen Perry's framework, where it had, does it matter to the customer, yes or no, and then functional or end to end.
That's right.
And what is that, functional or end to end what?
So is it good for a function of the organization, or is it valuable to the whole organization?
Okay, so more of optimizing across the system versus just locally.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so is it just for one small part of the organisation, or does it benefit the whole organisation? And most organisations have no idea, which is where you go and study.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Hey.
I'm curious about the financial department of the organization that's going to adapt all this.
Yep.
I can imagine it's for the financial people the most dangerous, maybe, because you need less of them, and also the kind of people who choose for the financial jobs. Yep. I think it's most distance to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the beyond budgeting, that's why the beyond budgeting is struggling, because it smacks into that sort of conventional thinking. But in organisations where we work, there's that two-stage process. So they say, well, IT to us is just a number. What you do internally is entirely up to you. So we'll keep that number and still keep the budgeting process, but go ahead with that VC funding type idea, especially if you've got small units of work, because they're getting a better idea of return on investment, because it happens faster. And then over time, you can then start working on, well, we're actually tying a lot of people here up and doing the budgeting process. So there are organisations that have no budgets at all. In this day and age is great, but that's the beyond budgeting movement. But it's quite a hard sell into that traditional mindset, because again, all of your financial career has been, we have to have budgets. Okay, any other questions? Can I quickly show you something? So I just quickly want to show you this. So listening to the Kata talk a minute ago, I really recommend an article called Learning to Lead at Toyota by Stephen Spear. And what he says, he studied Toyota and worked in Toyota and had to recreate a Toyota factory in the US. And he said that if you boil down Toyota production system, it really comes down to the whole system as a series of nested experiments. And every employee lives that all throughout every day. It's all about experimentation. And managers learn TPS the hard way. They spend 3 months in the work before they go and manage. It's interesting, isn't it? And when they come out of that, they realize their job is not to tell people what to do. Their job is not to go and actually improve the work. Their job is enablers, helping the people that do the work to improve the work. So finally, these are the main learning points that he came up with. There's no substitute for direct observation. That's study. The second one is proposed changes should also be structured as experiments. You heard me talk about experiments. Third is workers and managers should experiment as much as possible, so they work together experimenting on the work. And the fourth one is that managers act as enablers, not fixers. So I'll probably work this into the next version of the talk, because this, I think, is really important in the 21st century. Anyway, thanks very much.